So here's the first stop on our TCC campus Gymnosperm tour. This is a Sago Palm, which is a misnomer. This is not actually a palm because a palm is an angiosperm. This is a Gymnosperm, and it is a cycad specifically. And so what we're going to see as we zoom in on this thing or get closer to this thing is, remember, a Gymnosperm has naked seeds. That's where it gets its name. And if we move in here, here are the reproductive parts that you can see. And what I'm pointing to right here is a seed. Here's another one. Here's another one. You can see those seeds are right out in the open. They're not enclosed in a fruit, and that makes this a Gymnosperm, or a naked seed plant. Now, Sago palms, again, not an actual palm. This is a tropical plant. This is not native to Florida. This actually came from Southeast Asia. We think Japan, in tropical areas in Japan. But it's of course widely used horticulturally. We can see some other examples of Sago palms down here. So this is the second stop on our TCC Gymnosperms tour. And what you're seeing in front of this are two glorious examples of longleaf pine trees here on our campus. And these are iconic Florida species. They once dominated most areas of Florida, in fact the Southeast in general, all the way up through North Carolina, and what we call the coastal plain. So we call these longleaf pines because of their needles are long, and it's hard without comparing to another tree, but we can do that later. You see they have longer needles, and they are in bunches of 3 coming out of the stem, which is one characteristic of longleaf pine trees. So we call them leaves, right, even though they're needles, because they are modified leaves. So they evolved from leaves, and they're thin because that reduces water loss. And that's one of the reasons why, I apologize, very bad videography here. They do very well in dry areas. As we know, Florida has very dry soils. They need to retain their water more than other plants, and so they do very well. And you can see the pine needles scattered throughout the ground here. Another thing that pine needles do is that they carry fire. And when fire comes through, that allows the babies, right, the little seeds, which you can see some of them scattered throughout here, to germinate better in that competition. So longleaf pines are considered conifers. They're in that group of Gymnosperms because of their cones, right? Conifer, C-O-N, starts with, so does cone. And this would be a female cone here. That's what you're seeing here on the ground. And if we move over here, we can see a male cone. There aren't many around because they're usually prevalent in the spring, and now it's fall. But here's a male cone versus a female cone, very different in size. And of course, the seeds are produced on the female cone there. So there's some other fun characteristics or fun facts of longleaf pine. Of course, number one, you can see it's getting to be fall, and they still have a lot of needles on the tree, and they are green. That's why we call conifers evergreen. So obviously they lose their needles. We saw them all over the ground, but they only lose them bits at a time. They don't dump all their leaves like an angiosperm would, like a maple tree or an oak tree. So here's some other characteristics of conifers that make them particularly good at living in terrestrial environments. So one thing I hope you can see as we go over here are little sticky spots. Let me try to zoom in on that. There we go. Little sticky bits coming off of the tree like that. And this is actually what we call resin. So this is not sap. Sap comes from phloem. This is resin, which are separate canals running through the trunk of the tree, and you can see all that dried resin on this on the trunk of this pine tree. Now, when we think of amber, like insects getting trapped in amber as fossils, that's resin is what we're talking about there. And resin helps, there's a reason why insects are trapped in it, and it helps protect the tree from little bugs and herbivores that might want to be eating the inside of the bark, which is a tender place for them to live. So you can see the resin going all the way down on this tree, and it's there for protection. That's about all I have to say. There's a couple of fun things about this tree right here. You can see on the side of this bark, here is a cicada casing. This is not a living insect. It's shedded, it's molt. cicadas live underground for a very long time as larvae. So they actually live underground and they drink plant phloem, which is not very good. Remember, it's all sugar. It's like if you just drank Kool-Aid constantly as your food source, you wouldn't grow very fast. So it takes them almost a decade, or decades, more than a decade, to mature. They emerge from the soil and they, molt, and that's what you hear. When you hear cicadas calling, they're mating and forming the next generation of cicadas. And I believe that is all I have for you in terms of the conifers. So again, this is the most speciose and economically important gymnosperm out there. We'll talk more about its economic importance later in class. So this is stop 3 on our TCC gymnosperm tour. I don't have a lot to say about this tree, but it is a gymnosperm. This is a cedar, and it is considered a conifer because, again, it has these needle-like leaves. They're not quite pine needles, but you can see they are highly reduced here and have all the same things that pine needles would have. So as you can see, a cedar is a pretty gnarly tree here, and like pine trees and other conifers, they do very well in dry environments. There are actually no cones right now on this tree or around that I can show you, but it does produce tiny cones just like a pine tree would. Again, not a lot to say about this tree, other than I just do want to point out, we talked about resurrection fern in class, and here's what we have, a resurrection fern growing on this cedar tree right here, and it hasn't rained in a while, so this resurrection fern is not doing so well, but once it rains again, which it should this weekend because a hurricane is coming through, these things should fluff back out and do just fine. So these ferns are not dead. They will resurrect once a little water enters their world, enters their atmosphere. And we also have on this tree some more of those cicadas I was talking about earlier. I'm not crazy enough to talk to a cicada casing, maybe a living cicada. Anyway, these are cedars. I believe it's if you look on the Lebanon flag, if you're from that part of the area, here's some more cicada casings there. It's the national tree of Lebanon. And that's all I had to say about cedars. So here's the third conifer on our TCC gymnosperms tour. It's hard to say sometimes. And this is a juniper. And once again, as I said, it's a conifer because you can see it has number 1 little needle-like leaves on it. It doesn't have huge cones like a pine tree would, but if you zoom in on here on some of these leaves, if you see those little yellow dots there, kind of on the end of the needles, those are the little cones of junipers. And they're a little bit more fleshy than pine cones would be, and so we sometimes call those juniper berries, although they're not actually berries, because again, berries are fruits, and this is a gymnosperm, it does not have fruits. A fun fact is that juniper berries are used to make gin, so it gives gin its very distinct flavor if you're a fan of gin and tonics like I am. If we zoom in here, again, remember our resin that was on our pine tree. This is a gymnosperm, it's got the same thing. We've got some resin coming out of here, this sticky substance coming from resin canals, and that again is used to help prevent insect attack. I didn't mention this with pines earlier, but the leaves also have resin in them. So if you look at, these pine needles, I should say, juniper leaves, but very similar to pine needles, they would also have resin canals, if I can zoom in on these things, going through them, and well, that doesn't matter. And so they also can help carry fire and eliminate the competition. So that is a juniper, another example of a gymnosperm on our campus. So what we have here is a palm tree. Now remember, our first visit was to the Sago Palm, and I told you that was misnamed because the Sago Palm is a gymnosperm. This is an actual palm tree. When we go into angiosperms, it is a monocot, but it is an angiosperm because remember, angiosperms, the seeds are in a vessel, and that vessel is the fruit. And if we look up here within this palm tree, we can see all of the fruits up there on the tree. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish fruits from seeds, but if we zoom down here to the ground, and we see a couple of those fruits now are here on the ground, and if I actually pick one up and open it, whoops, I did not mean to explode it quite that much, but what we can see is it's fleshy, right? And there are seeds actually down inside here, and that's how we know it's a fruit, because it's covered. This would be the ovary of that plant that's covering the seed there. So that's what makes it an angiosperm, or fruit with a vessel. A cycad, right, does not have, its seeds are out and exposed, and we already talked about what that looks like. Another fun thing about this palm tree right here is you can see ferns growing all over it. And remember, plants that grow on other plants, and ferns often do this, are called epiphytes. So here are some good examples of epiphytes that are on this palm tree. So plants that live in tropical areas like palms, and this palm is native here to Florida, this is a cabbage palm, do have these palm-shaped leaves, so this is pretty typical. But again, this is your angiosperm, not a cycad, so not a gymnosperm. So this is a bald cypress, and it's called a bald cypress because, unlike most gymnosperms and almost no other conifers, it will lose its leaves or needles in the winter and thus become bald. We're still in the fall, but you can already kind of see, if I switch this camera over here, the leaves are turning reddish yellow, just like a deciduous tree would, and they're going to lose them. Of course, they're pulling their chlorophyll out. This is still a conifer, so you can see the cones on here, on this bald cypress tree right here, and so it is in that group of gymnosperms there. But again, the leaves are a little bit more leaf-like instead of needle-like, and they will drop in the fall. Bald cypress and pond cypress typically do better in wetter environments, and it's probably because of their leaves that help them with that. They're not as concerned with reducing water loss because they live in wet environments.
So this is the final stop on our Gymnosperms of TCC tour. I hope you have enjoyed our virtual tour this semester. And we've covered three, or I should say this is the third of the three major groups of gymnosperms. We've already covered the first two. We saw a cycad, and the second was a bunch of conifers that we've seen. And here's our third major group, which is Ginkgo phyta. And there's only one living representative of this group, and that is the Ginkgo tree you're seeing here in this picture. I should say my phone died and I ran out of room before I was able to video this on the spot, so I'm doing this from the luxury of my own computer. So if you recall from lecture, Ginkgo trees, remember, are living fossils. They're the last remaining member of a once numerous group on the planet, and there are no natural populations left of these species. All living trees came from probably temple grounds in either China or Japan, and they're very nice looking, they're very handsome trees, so they are propagated for landscaping purposes now, and that's what it's doing here on the TCC campus. Ginkgos live in moderate climates like you would experience in North Florida, and so they do very well. One characteristic of trees in modern climates is they often lose their leaves, which you can see happening here. So this tree is one of the few deciduous gymnosperms, that is, it loses its leaves all at once. And if you look on the ground here below this tree, there's a bunch of yellow ginkgo leaves down there. Up on the tree, of course, it's going to lose the rest of those as fall proceeds. So one fun fact about ginkgo we discussed in class is not only is it deciduous, that is, it loses its leaves, but it is also dioecious. That is, some plants are male and some plants are female, and that's more unique among plants in general. So what you're seeing here is a male tree, and we know it's male, number one, because it doesn't smell terrible. We also don't see any seeds on it, but almost any tree, any ginkgo tree propagated worldwide is going to be male because the females produce those very smelly fruit-like coverings of their seeds, although remember, this is a gymnosperm, so it doesn't have official fruits like other types of trees would. So that's about all I have for you in terms of Ginkgo, and I believe this is the only one that's on campus. It's near the SM building. I hope you enjoyed your tour, and if you have any questions about these, of course, we can talk more about them in class. Thank you.